Welcome to the IISS, the only building that's not being torn down in the 5-block radius. My name is Dina Allen. I'm editor of Survival and a senior fellow here. So the 6-month deadline for negotiations between Iran and the P5+1 over its nuclear program expired last weekend without an agreement. I don't think many people were surprised at that result. And there has been a temptation, I guess, to view the very fact that these negotiations happened at all by paraphrasing the man of letters who walked these streets, that it was a surprise to see them happening at all. But now we have to face the question of whether this is a defeat for diplomacy, even if it was an expected one, and if it's not going to be defeat in the rolled over negotiations, what are the prospects for something that we can call success? And to answer these questions, I'm joined by two colleagues with whom I've worked closely on these issues. The first to my left is Mark Fitzpatrick, who's director of the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, that's the right word, program here at IISS. He's author of a number of publications here, including the Adelphi book, The Iran Nuclear Crisis, Avoiding Worst-Case Outcomes, and a lot of, it says here, dozens of articles on the topic, many of them published in Survival, for which he's a contributing editor. He had a long career in the U.S. Foreign Service, and if culminating as a position of acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Dina Esfandiary is a research associate here in the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament program, focusing on general security issues and especially Middle East proliferation issues, and within that topic, especially the Iran program. Dina, as I recall, was born in Iran and went back for the first time in a very long time last month, I think. So has some on-the-ground perspective for the Iranian position. We'll start with Mark.
Thanks, Dana. So the negotiators didn't get a deal, but they kept Iran's nuclear program capped, and they kept diplomacy alive, at least for the next 4 months. And I think most of you know the details, but let me just review them quickly of what this 4-month extension entails. Iran gets $700 million a month in frozen assets returned to them. Now just put that in context. 5 times that amount is frozen in Iran's revenues every month. So they're just getting a small portion of their money that's been frozen, locked up in bank accounts. All other sanctions remain in place, other than the ones that were lifted at the time of the joint plan of action back in November. But most sanctions remain in place, and even some of the ones that were lifted, Iran doesn't get any benefit out of them because foreign banks don't want to do business with Iran. They're worried about the kind of fines that have been levied on BNP Paribas last month, billions of dollars. So Iran doesn't get a lot out of this deal. They're not giving a lot either. The program is capped. That's about as much as you can say. The 6 powers negotiating with them wanted to get more non-proliferation benefits out of the extension. They wanted Iran's stockpile of 5% enriched uranium, a stockpile that is about 8,500 kilograms, enough for maybe 6 weapons if further enriched. They wanted to bring that down. They wanted Iran to oxidize some of that. Iran agreed to keep that stockpile constant, to cap it, but not to reduce it, because they want to keep that as leverage for the comprehensive agreement that they still hope to strike. And so in exchange, they couldn't get that stockpile reduced, but they did some other things. The stockpile of 2% enriched uranium, the tails from the 20%, they agreed to neutralize that by downblending it. They agreed that the 20% oxide is 1/4 of that's going to be made into fuel rods. for the Tehran research reactor, and once you make it into fuel rods, it becomes even more hard to use in weapons. And then eventually they said they would put all of that into fuel rods. So there's some minor non-proliferation benefits. They couldn't strike a deal because of this huge gulf between the two sides on the size and scope of the enrichment program. They did make progress in several areas. On Iraq, the research reactor at Iraq, Iran agreed to redesign it so that it would produce only 1 kilogram of plutonium a year rather than the 8 to 12 kilograms of weapons-grade plutonium under the original design. Now, they didn't totally agree on the Iraq redesign because the West wanted to convert it to a light water moderated reactor so that the non-proliferation benefits would be irreversible. Iran didn't want to make it irreversible. They just wanted to downpower it, maybe do something else to reduce the output, but that's reversible. So it's not a done deal on Iraq, but they at least came closer. On Fordow, Iran agreed to, I think they agreed to remove the 3,000 centrifuges that are there, or at least they agreed to convert it to an R&D plant, not a uranium enrichment plant. I don't know the details, but apparently that was solvable. Iran also agreed on a tricky issue of sanctions relief. They had been demanding immediate sanctions relief, but they realized it's just not going to happen. It's not legally in the United States, so they realized that it could be phased. So those are some important areas of progress, and you could probably come up with a few others. But on the big issue of the size and scope of the enrichment program, they're just hugely apart, as they have been from the very beginning. The Joint Plan of Action of last November 24th agreed on an important principle that practical needs, that Iran could be allowed an enrichment capacity consistent with its practical needs. And that seemed kind of reasonable. When we used to have workshops on this and talking with Iranian academics, we all kind of agreed that's a pretty good concept. The disagreement is, how do you define practical needs? The six powers negotiating with Iran said, okay, you need enriched uranium to fuel the Tehran research reactor. You've already got probably 10 years worth of 20% enriched uranium. You don't need a lot more. If you convert the Iraq reactor to light water moderated, you need a little bit of 3.5 to 5% enriched uranium for that. And you don't need more than about 2,000 centrifuges for that purpose. Iran says, no. We need to be able to refuel the Bushehr nuclear power plant once the contract with Russia runs out in 2021. And that would require a massive increase in their enrichment capacity. And that's what Ayatollah Khamenei was talking about when he said that they have an absolute need for 190,000 separative work units. It was kind of interesting that he got to the technical detail of talking about separative work units, which only 5 people in this room probably understand. If you do, I know. But it's equivalent to about 190,000 first-generation centrifuges. That really boxed in the Iranian negotiators when he said that. They tried to put a spin on it by saying, look, he talked about, 2 things. He talked about it, you don't need it in 2 or 3 years or maybe 5 years. He's talking about eventually. But then Salehi, the head of the Atomic Energy Agency, said, well, we need this by 2021 when the Russian contract runs out. So they'll need to gear up for that. They need to test and mass produce centrifuges. And Salehi said, look, we don't need 190,000 centrifuges. We could get more advanced models, much smaller number. If you had the most recent model centrifuges that Iran has been testing, maybe you'd only maybe need 10,000 or less. So it tried to say, look, the numbers, you could have a lot fewer. But look, for the West, it doesn't matter whether it's 10,000 sixth-generation centrifuges or 190,000 first generation. It's the output that's important. And that output, if you had that many 190,000 SWU, the breakout time, if Iran wanted to put it to weapons use, would be down to days, maybe 2 weeks at most. So that was just a non-starter. The 6 powers negotiating with Iran, and it's important here to say it's not just the West. Russia and China were also very much part of this. Said, look, you don't need to power up Bushehr when the current contract ends, because Russia is ready and willing and eager to provide the fuel for the lifetime of the reactor. And Iran, I'm sorry, but you really can't do it yourselves by 2021. Maybe some distant date, but it's not easy to produce fuel for nuclear power plants. Westinghouse, the giant American firm that has a lot of experience producing fuel for other power reactors, tried to do it for the Russian VVER reactors in the Czech Republic and in Ukraine, and found it tremendously difficult on both technical and legal grounds. So, as Bob Einhorn said in his paper from Brookings Institute yesterday, was it technically, and I've lost my place here, technically unfeasible, legally questionable, and on safety grounds, if Iran tried to produce that fuel, it would be a huge safety risk. So the practical needs for refueling Bushehr just aren't there. Maybe sometime in the future when Iran is producing its own fuel, you could envision that. And that gets to the issue of the scope of the duration of the limits. The six powers are asking for 10 years or maybe 20 years. Iran wants it 5, 6, 7 years. And only after that duration is finished would then there be an open door for Iran to have a larger scale enrichment plant, even though, I mean, it wouldn't make any economic sense for them to do that. As you know, there's a lot of talk about breakout time. The size of the centrifuge program that would be allowed is often spoken of in terms of breakout time. How long could Iran conceivably, if they decided to use their enrichment capacity for weapons purposes, make enough highly enriched, 90% highly enriched uranium for a weapon's worth? And that's the breakout time concept. It's an artificial concept because it's just, I mean, it's theoretical. You can do the calculations, but for a country that's never done this before, it would take longer. But still, it's become the standard concept. And the West in particular, but the six powers had been demanding that the breakout time be measured in years. That was their initial going-in position, years. Well, that's 24 months at least, right? Then I think they'd come down to 1 year. 1 year is equivalent to something less than 2,000 first-generation centrifuges. I think they would be willing, if Iran were willing to lower its, to come down to, say, 6 months breakout time. That's, among Washington and London analysts, that seems to be the prevailing. It can't be any less than 6 months. I think in Tel Aviv it's probably no less than 12 months or more. So 6 months would be about 4,000 centrifuges of the first generation. But the problem is that Iran just was not willing, not ready anyway, to make any cutbacks. They were willing to freeze the program for many years, several years anyway, Zarif said. They're willing to talk about different numbers depending on the SWU output. They tried to come up with a lot of different permutations, but the basic issue was that they didn't want to reduce the numbers. They didn't want to reduce the number of operating centrifuges, which 9,400, nor did they want to dismantle the additional 10,000 installed centrifuges. And, there's an issue about dismantlement, whether you'd really have to take them all apart into itsy-bitsy pieces or if there's some other way to deal with them. But they didn't even want to take them out of commission. So the issue of dismantlement wasn't even broached. Well, I'm sure it was broached, but they didn't get beyond it. Just one other point on the breakout time. There are different ways to, there are different variables that go into breakout time. Usually it's spoken of in terms of numbers of centrifuges, but transparency is also important. If the six powers had strong confidence that any breakout would be detected right away, then the breakout time could be shorter because they would have time to take the steps. Now, you could argue, well, you think about all the time it takes for, look at the Syria case, all the different discussions that went into that. Do you need congressional approval? Do you need parliamentary approval and so forth, UN approval? But still, if Iran were breaking out and going for what looked like weapons, I'm pretty sure that the United States and Israel would take action to stop it. So you wouldn't probably need 6 months. You could probably accept shorter if you had complete transparency. And of course, you don't have complete transparency, but the more transparency, the better. There is a trade-off there. There's another trade-off in terms of the stockpile, the feedstock, the 5% enriched uranium. Remember I said it's 8,500 kilograms? That's equivalent to maybe 6 bombs. If you could get that eliminated, then Iran has to start from scratch if they want to build a weapon. They've got to produce more of the 5% and then go up to 90%. So that also lengthens their time. So I suspect one of the suggestions that was made in the talks is, okay, Iran, ship your stockpile of 5% enrichment out of the country. Get rid of it. Or, Iran might have probably said in response, no, we're not going to get rid of it. We'll convert it to oxide form. Oxide form, once it's converted, it takes longer to reconvert it. But I don't think the West would accept that because it can be reconverted, and it's not 100% certain that Western intelligence agencies would be able to spot the facility that Iran might use for the reconversion. So they want that stockpile exported out of the country. I think that would have been one way. And then you could have traded off the number of centrifuges. You could have got closer to what Zarif was demanding. But they still were so far apart. So looking ahead for the next 4 months, I'm sorry to say I don't see a basis for a deal. If we couldn't get it now, I don't know how we're going to get it in 4 months because of this basic difference over the number of centrifuges. And the way I see it is, what would cause the supreme leader to agree that Iran doesn't need 190,000 SWU in the future, and they don't need 10,000 operating centrifuges today, that they could go to 4,000? What would cause him to make that shift? And especially given the chaos in the region, I think if you're in Iran's position and you're looking around and you're seeing your ally in Syria, well, it's better than it was, but your ally in Iraq, it's not so good. Maybe you want to keep that nuclear weapons option, not exercise it, but keep that option. Don't reduce it. That would be my judgment. So I just, maybe, now some people say, well, if you apply additional sanctions, that's the only way that Khamenei will be persuaded to accept cutbacks, more sanctions. But, everything I know about Iran, and Dina will maybe say this too, is that they don't bow to pressure. They do have other trading partners, and their response will be more sanctions, stop the talks. We're walking out of here. They've threatened to do that. I'm pretty sure that that's probably what they do. Now, maybe not forever. Maybe it's a temporary walkout. But how long would that temporary do? Because once you walk out of talks, then you need some positive trigger to come back in, and it's difficult to get it started again. So I'm not, I think new sanctions at this point would break diplomacy, because that's the whole point of the interim deal. A cap on Iran's capabilities and a cap on sanctions. If you break one, the other's going to break. The deal was set for 4 months to be November 24th, while the current Congress is still constituted the way it is, while the U.S. Senate is in the hands of the Democratic Party, and Harry Reid, the leader of the Senate, can keep another sanctions bill from coming to the floor. But U.S. midterm elections early November could change that. If it flips, then it becomes more of a real crapshoot in how Obama can continue to fend off sanctions and keep diplomacy alive. My suggestion that I wrote in a survival blog post was that find some other interim deal that makes the situation better for both sides. I proposed a deal on Iraq. At least block that path to nuclear weapons so they can't produce plutonium nuclear weapons. That, if you could do that, and I'm sure you can do that in the next 4 months, as long as you break the principle of it's all or nothing. But so if you're not going to get all, you might as well try to get something, and I think Iraq might be something, and that might be the basis for keeping diplomacy alive beyond 4 months. But Dina, what do you think?
Thank you. So I think what I'll do is I'll give the Iranian view on the talks and the extension, and then I'll come back to whether I think we're likely to have a deal or not. In terms of the Iranian view of the talks, well, first, this was a new Iranian team. It was more professional. It was more experienced. And it was a team that had the Supreme Leader's mandate, which is quite important. Before the interim deal, the Supreme Leader spoke about this heroic flexibility that he was going to give his negotiators. And then during the negotiations after the interim deal, he spoke about supporting the negotiators in their endeavors. But he's also quite mindful of his own situation. He is keen to preserve his position in power, of course. And so he's preparing the grounds both for success in terms of the support that he gives to the negotiators, but also failure by saying that, you know, he allowed the talks to go through. He gave the negotiators all the power that he could possibly give them, and if it fails, it's because, well, you know, you can't really talk to Great Satan and all. So, for Iran, the main issue is how they're going to sell the deal as a win back in Tehran. They have boxed themselves in after years of building the nuclear issue up as a major national issue of national interest and prestige. And so they have to be able to translate whatever the final deal looks like as a win back in Tehran. So one example of why the interim deal was viewed as a success was because although there was no acceptance of Iran's right to enrich, because there is no such right, the fact that the negotiators were able to move past no enrichment meant that Iran was able to basically translate it as the West has now accepted our right to enrich. So that's a victory for us. This new Iranian team has a better understanding of the negotiations, but also the difficulties that everybody faces. For example, they really grasp the difficulties that Obama faces back home with Congress, which is why they said from the beginning that they wanted to ignore all of the rhetoric that was coming out of the U.S., but also the U.S. ignore what was being said in Iran. But what's interesting is that I've noticed that they spent the first few months in particular learning about some of the specific constraints that they didn't understand that the P5+1 had. One example of this is the whole sanctions relief timeline. So Iran didn't initially understand that it would be impossible for the U.S. to basically grant permanent sanctions relief. And so you could see that in some of the statements that they made regarding the front loading of sanctions before we sign any deal, for example. But after months of briefings by sanctions experts and officials and diplomats in Tehran in particular, recently Iran has changed its focus in the discussions to how to obtain as much as possible in the immediate aftermath of a final nuclear deal before it's mothballed by Congress, for example. In terms of how the talks are viewed, so they're generally viewed positively in Tehran. The population is tired of the nuclear issue. What they often say is, you know, is it worth it? At what cost are we pursuing this issue? And this is especially the case after they witnessed some of the short-term benefits of the interim deal. For example, the fact that the Iranian economy is supposed to grow a little bit this year compared to the last couple of years. One of the things that most Iranians say when you talk to them in Iran is they use the phrase mishe in Farsi, which is, don't worry, it'll happen. And the idea is that they basically want to wrap this issue up so that we can focus on internal problems like the economy. And that's also because they know that a lot of Rouhani's policies are very much dependent, particularly economic policies, are very much dependent on at least some form of sanctions relief and a little bit of flexibility in doing business with Iran. So there's like a quiet confidence in Iran that a final deal will happen. This is good in some ways because it gives the negotiators some space to come to an agreement, because everybody understands that Iran is going to have to make serious concessions. And it's positive for the Rouhani administration because Rouhani's managed to successfully frame the way the negotiators are talking in Iran as Iran willing to make concessions. And so any failure should be successfully blamed on the West, at least within Iran. But there's not a lot of thought being given to the impact of failure of talks on the national mood and whether there's going to be a backlash. In terms of the hardliners and critics of the negotiations, there was a fear that they would speak up in particular after the interim deal. But it seemed like most of the discontent was kept in check. They did try to mount a couple of opposition campaigns during these negotiations, including one called the Concerned Movement, which basically set up a series of conferences and made statements, but it was largely viewed as a bit pointless. And in terms of what Khamenei did during these talks, well, firstly, he ordered the hardliners and critics not to criticize the talks and the negotiators. He also, with Rouhani, went through quite a bit of effort to, in some ways, rein in the IRGC, to control them, to tell them, you know, stop making any kind of negative statements. And it's interesting to view that in terms of whether he thinks that the IRGC is getting too powerful now or not. The result is that in June, the loudest opposition that existed in Iran basically fizzled out when key conservatives like the Speaker of the Majlis, Ali Laranjani, Tehran Mayor Ghalibaf, former nuclear negotiator Jalili, and the Chief of Staff of the Army basically all urged against attacking the Rouhani government in any way in the meantime. But recently, there have been growing frustrations in Tehran as well. And perhaps this is a result of how the Rouhani has successfully framed the talks as Iran making concessions. Many are feeling like Iran is perhaps giving away too much. You know, their willingness to change Iraq and Fordo, for example, and even, according to what I heard, but this is different to what Mark said, is the willingness to discuss smaller centrifuge numbers as long as Iran gets something in return. This came out in early July. They feel that the West is just being too, too unreasonable. You know, asking for 20+ years on a deal and no R&D, for example. It's too much. They're asking for too much. So there was fear that there would be some kind of backlash in Iran to the lack of progress in the talks. And this is perhaps where Khamenei's speech comes in. Maybe this speech was his way of basically expressing his discontent and frustration with the talks. Or it could have also been his way of asserting control over the negotiating process, or of, preparing the grounds in case of failure to say, well, like I said, I've supported these talks, it hasn't worked out, we're not willing to give everything up. And also perhaps to show that Iran is not, although it wants a deal and it wants sanctions relief, it's not willing to do it at any cost. In terms of how the extension is viewed from Tehran, it's still early days to judge exactly what everybody thinks of it, but you do get the sense that there is, again, a sense of disappointment and frustration. Many thought that this could be done and dusted by the July 20th deadline, but they're still quite hopeful that they might end up with a deal in the end. If there is a deal, and I don't think a lot of thought has been given to this either, there are some problems that remain. The two main ones are its implementation, particularly given the constraints in the US and the hardliners in Iran. In Tehran, there hasn't been a lot of expectation management being done on the Iranian population. There's really not much planning going into just managing the Iranian population's expectations on what a final deal will mean and how they will feel the effects of it. So many in Iran, for example, believe that sanctions relief will be immediate, and its effect will be felt immediately on the economy, and so everything will be rosy and fine the day after a deal. And so it's quite important, perhaps, for the administration to use these next 4 months to at least try to explain that this is completely unlikely to happen. If there is no deal, or the effect of no deal will probably be that there'll be, again, serious disappointment throughout the country, and the question will be, what kind of popular backlash are we going to end up with? And this is going to be dependent on who the Iranian population's anger is going to be targeted at. Are they going to target it towards the Rouhani administration for failing to finish it off? Or are they going to target the West because the West has been asking too much? I'll move on to why I think that it's likely that we will get a deal, or at least I'm hopeful that we will get a deal. In my view, all negotiations are about what parties want and how much they can compromise. So what has changed in these negotiations is not so much what the P5+1 in Iran want, but how badly both sides want a solution to this problem that's been going on for decades. Also, perhaps, how much they would like a deal fast, or as fast as possible. Why is this? I think it's because both sides are just painfully aware of the downsides of not coming to an agreement. And an example of this is how negotiators left talk of renewing the interim agreement until 48 hours before the deadline. I mean, nobody wanted to spend time talking about a possible rollover when they could focus all their attention on the final nuclear deal. Also, progress over the last 8 months, and particularly over the last month, has really been significant. I mean, it's been astonishing. We never thought any of this would be possible. A year ago, nobody would have expected that Iran would have signed on to an interim agreement that's capped its program and even rolled some of it back. So yes, significant gaps remain, but this is no surprise. Of course there are significant gaps between both sides. I think that both sides have shown, up until now, perhaps not fast enough, but certainly enough flexibility to leave the option open to continue making compromise, to continue moving forward. For example, one of the things that the Iranians said from the beginning is nobody's going to touch Fordo and nobody's going to touch our 20% enriched uranium. Well, today, we don't have 20% enriched uranium anymore, and they're discussing turning Fordo into an R&D facility. So I think the willingness to compromise is there on both sides. I just think they're going to drag it out a little bit more to really show that they're, we don't want to compromise, but at the end they may have to. In terms of I also think that the extra time is good. It will allow the negotiators to basically, who right now are probably exhausted, go back home and really take stock of where we are in this process and what are the compromises that they're willing to make on the issues that are the sticky issues at the moment. Finally, in terms of the positive potential impact of a potential final nuclear deal in the region, up until today, all engagement of Iran has been dependent on a nuclear deal. Nobody wanted to talk to Iran until the nuclear issue was resolved first, because this is the issue that everybody's put emphasis on. So I think that if we do have a deal, it really opens up the possibility of dialogue with Iran on a range of regional issues, which could include, but certainly are not limited to, coordination, for example, on what's going on, coordination with the West on what's going on in Iraq. And I say coordination because I don't think cooperation is likely, because that's far too soon. But certainly coordinate because they have a common enemy now. So, and perhaps even finding some kind of diplomatic solution on Syria, because after all, you're not going to get a diplomatic solution on Syria without involving Iran. In fact, you're not going to get any solution on Syria without involving Iran, which is far too involved in Syria at the moment. So perhaps that's something else that they could discuss. Thanks.
Thank you very much, both Mark and Dina. We have half an hour for questions. Let me ask the first one or two, or one to each. Mark, you concluded with an assessment that's very familiar, which is that, why would Iran logically want to give up a potential nuclear weapons capability? And the degree of latency of that is, another question and maybe negotiable. I'm just curious if you've seen, that was the assessment for a long time. Has anything come out of these negotiations so far, do you think, that sort of sheds light on what the real Iranian intention is beyond that sort of specific, beyond that general idea of keeping options open? And maybe the answer is no, but I'm just wondering if we've learned anything from these negotiations. And of course, it may be different between different parties. I mean, obviously, it's not a unitary actor. Dina, you said that Iranians have learned something about the West through, or at least the negotiating team has learned something about the West in terms of, the ease of relieving sanctions and so forth. But in general, on your last visit there, do you think there's a realistic picture of what the West's position is in general? For example, that the West really believes, or at least the United States and I think most of its allies really believe that this is about nuclear weapons, whether actual or virtual. Mark?
Yeah. Stephen Walt, American political scientist, concluded toward the end of the negotiations that it's absolutely clear that Iran wants a path to a bomb, and the opposite objective is the one its negotiating partners, no path to a bomb. Now, Stephen Walt is I wouldn't say sympathetic to Iran, but he's very sympathetic toward diplomacy, and he argues against sanctions and so forth. But he's not speaking for Iran, but that's been my view ever since I started in this issue, and I've never seen anything to change it, because Iran has always wanted to have that capability, and it's a matter of tactics, you might say, or timing. And what we saw in the talks was Iran willing to talk about the timing for when that capability could be implemented if push came to shove. And I'm not saying that push has come to shove, but if they were to change their posture, the fatwa, change that. So that tactical flexibility was certainly evident. But when Khamenei says they have an absolute need for 190,000 separative work units, and it's clear to everyone on the opposite side of the table that they don't have a need for that at all, because there are so many other ways to keep Bushehr running. So many other ways. It's doing it yourself is so costly, not just in the cost of doing it, but the opportunity cost and the sanctions cost and the possibility that leads to war. It's so costly. Why would you do this? I know we get back to intentions, and we can have the same old debate, but no, I didn't see too much that really shifted that, except for Khamenei's statement that I thought it put it pretty starkly.
Okay.
In terms of understanding the West, I think it really depends who you ask. For example, if you're talking to the current administration, Rouhani's team, I really do think that they have a much better grasp of both the way political systems work in the West, but also in terms of the nuclear negotiators, what the P5+1 wants, and what some of their demands are, and what some of their fears are in terms of an Iranian nuclear program. The question then becomes, are they willing to give into that or not? I think that for the supreme leaders, the hardliners, some of the critics in Iran, I'm not sure. I mean, I think that obviously some do, and when I say some, I mean within the hardliners. The supreme leader is an interesting question. He's obviously been, dealing with these issues for quite a while now, so you would think that he would have a good grasp of what the West wants and what this is really about. But I think he's just a little too wrapped up in safeguarding Iranian interests, prestige, etc., to really sit down and try to understand what the problem is here. And for some, there is a true belief that a nuclear program is within Iran's right. So why should it give in? Many other people have one, so why shouldn't they be able to develop their program as an NPT state, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then in terms of the population, I think it's pretty simple that the population are largely ignorant of exactly what's going on in the nuclear negotiations. And to be honest, I'm not sure they really care, aside from wanting to resolve this issue and get it out of the way.
Okay. That's good. Thank you very much. Okay, the first question is here on the right. Please identify yourself.
Doesn't matter now, I'm a member here. Could you say something about the level of sort of transparency and confidence that there is about, during the negotiations? I'm thinking particularly about the IAEA. I mean, I read reports saying that the IAEA, feel that, they have a good visibility of what's going on, what's, the downgrading or the blending of the 20% material. I mean, is there more confidence and a sort of sense that this is a negotiation where people are actually squaring up to each other, or there's something more secret and going on behind the curtain?
Yeah, I probably should have said, first of all, that Iran completely adhered to all of its obligations in the Joint Plan of Action. The IEA had all the access that they were promised. There was never a hint that they were not fulfilling them. Now, the IEA is separately negotiating with Iran over this issue of the nuclear activities of a possible military dimension, for which there are several outstanding questions. And it's interesting that the next issue that is supposed to be resolved in those IAEA talks won't be resolved until sometime in September or so, but that'll be before the end of the 4-month extension period. So hopefully that will contribute something positive to the interim talks with the 6 parties. The IAEA has, in its reports, been pretty neutral and positive, and not being as critical as they were under the previous administration. So I think there's a pretty strong sense that they're dealing with people who are at least you can maybe don't trust them, but you have some confidence that you're dealing with people who are not totally pulling the wool over your eyes. Sorry, there's a better way of saying that.
Right here, sir. Yes.
Yeah, I'm Samir Puri, a member of the Institute. I was working in the Foreign Office, and I briefly worked on the counter-proliferation Iran side of things. I remember from my time doing that work that sometimes it becomes very technical in terms of the quid pro quo between the extent to which the Iranian nuclear program is advancing, the technical details, and the sanctions relief, which is also quite quantifiable, quite technical at times. I wanted to ask you about the issue of linkages with what these negotiations are really about, like proxy in some respects, and in terms of the notion of Iranian quest for respect in the region and its ability to exert itself regionally. But what I wanted to ask you, Dina in particular, was you talked about how this could obviously be a precursor to greater cooperation or coordination over certain issues. To what extent are, in your view, negotiators positively exploiting those linkages? Those problems, are there quite direct connections being formed, or is it just implicit in the sense if there is a deal on the technical issues, all of this will flow?
Can I just add to that? In terms of regional issues, obviously Iran has long sought to be recognized as a regional player. But aside from that, is there really anything going wrong for Iran right now that would lead it to want to cooperate or negotiate? I'm thinking in terms of Syria, or for that matter, well, Iraq, obviously. There's some difficulty, but anyway.
So, firstly, in answer to your question, there's no linkages. I mean, the negotiators have really specifically said we plan to talk only about the nuclear issue. We don't want to discuss anything else, and this deal will only be on the nuclear issue. When the Iraq thing broke out in June, I think the US and Iran sat down and had some discussions about Iraq, but it was very much on the sidelines of the negotiations. And again, I think Iran in particular, which is quite interesting, resisted bringing anything else into these discussions. I think that ties into the power and the mandate that the negotiating team have, in the sense that they've been told they can deal on the nuclear issue, nothing else. Handle that first, and then we'll see the rest. So I don't think that there are any links at all. Where there is perhaps a little bit of impact is that when you have a crisis like you do in Iraq, where you have a common enemy, as it were, even if there's no specific cooperation, coordination, or anything, you start to view the other person a little bit differently. So perhaps it'll, I don't want to say lighten the mood, but you know, the atmosphere might have been a little bit different in the last few days. In terms of whether anything's going wrong for Iran in the region, sure, and that's something that a lot of the Iranian administration and government officials will say. You know, our policy in Syria has paid off. Look at us today, and we're doing very well in other countries. And but you know, if they were really as well off as they claim they are, they wouldn't even be sitting at the negotiating table to start with. Iran, certainly this administration, and to a certain extent the Iranian population, I think, really wants to be talking to the West. It wants to be reintegrated into, you know, international relations. It wants to have Western business come its way. If it didn't, it's got perfect opportunities with Russia sitting on the sidelines with the, you know, the gas for oil deal, or China. I mean, it could easily turn that way, but it hasn't. So I think it's trying to explore its opportunities right now with the West and see where it can go.
Thanks. Sir.
IISS member Victor Thakur. I got some comments. Mark mentioned about potential changes in U.S. Congress. There is another factor. President Obama is desperate for a significant foreign policy success, and compared to other infernos, if I may put it this way, probably Iran offers better potential success. If you look at Israel, Palestine, Ukraine, Russia, Far East, China and Far East, etc. So I don't think, under present circumstances, either Israel and or US would be able to attack Iran at all. There will not be any deal at the end of these 4 months. In my personal opinion, I think there will be further final extension, and then there will be a deal if current infernos continue. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Well, thank you for your comment, which I'm going to rephrase as 2 questions. First, Mark, do you think that there is a suspicion in various places that Obama would be overeager for a deal? I wonder if you see any evidence for that. The second point was actually a question I was thinking about asking initially, actually maybe in regard to what people in Iran think. You stated that you believe military action in the event of a breakdown and weaponization is a real possibility, and I wonder if you could elaborate on that.
If I was a very suspicious type, and I just listened to what Senator John Kerry said on the 19th and the way he was praising the negotiations, I think I might get a sense that they are really eager for a deal. But knowing how Washington works, I know that however eager they might be, they're not going to take a deal that would be viewed as a bad deal by the majority of the members of the Congress and America's friends and I mean the political environment in the United States. And a bad deal would be one that did not reduce Iran's enrichment capability. That's a pretty I mean, there are many variables, but keeping the size of it is now would just, that won't sell politically. So, and I really don't think that Obama personally even would want to accept a deal just so they could have a place in history. I mean, you're right. Iran is the one issue among all these issues where he has some ability to shape events. So there is an inclination, but he does still have 2 years left on his calendar. So I wouldn't. Now let's hope that those 2 years don't result in that horrible worst-case outcome of bombing. But I remain convinced that if Iran were to go for broke, if they were to break out and seek to go down the weapons path in a more visible way, yes, the United States would take action. The question is whether they didn't do it so visibly, but they just incrementally expanded their enrichment program back to 20% enrichment. Incrementalism doesn't immediately trigger a military attack, and the question is, at what point is incremental get to the breaking point? What's the straw that breaks the camel's back? And I wouldn't put it past the United States and Israel to decide at some point it's just too much.
Sir.
It's Masato Kimura, Japanese freelance journalist. Thank you very much for insightful presentation. If I may, I would like to have question about financial sanctions. These days, currency seems to lethal weapons for Obama administration instead of real action. But this has a bad effect of currency perspective. One is more financial sanctions push them to Chinese side. And second, in the Chinese trade in Middle East, Chinese renminbi clearance rate is now 60%. And so I think financial sanction will decrease in the future. And thirdly, so what do you evaluate the competition between London market and New York market as if more sanctions, more money come to London, and UK doesn't want to follow the US sanction.
Okay, so generally about financial sanctions, I'd say. I'm not sure that all the ramifications are...
I think this is a case where the questioner knows more about the subject than I do. But look, I think in general that financial sanctions have proven to be so powerful a tool vis-a-vis Iran, and they're being applied vis-a-vis North Korea and now Russia. I think they will continue to be applied because they're a non-kinetic way of coercing. And there is a potential downside that countries will look to find other currencies other than the US dollar so that they won't be penalized inadvertently or through secondary sanctions. But now here where I'm a little bit weak ground, the size of the US financial sector is so dominant and huge that I can't imagine, certainly not the the Chinese currency in any way surpassing it, nor can I imagine that the euro, although there's a more possibility there, but because the United States and Europe are in such close sync, and particularly the United States and UK in such close sync on policy matters as well as economic. So I think that although the United Kingdom and the European Union won't be going along, with overwhelming, proactive, positive moves of their own towards sanctions, they can't but implement U.S. sanctions because otherwise they face fines, and that's the long and short of it.
We only have 10 minutes left, so I can't guarantee I'm going to get to everybody, but I'll start to bundle some. Well, let's take them in pairs and try to keep your questions short, starting with Nomi and then Dr. Konsari.
Thank you, Dina. Thank you very much. Sorry, Nomi Yakov, Chatham House. Thank you very much, Mark, Dina, and Dana, for this very insightful meeting. Dina, I'm very interested to hear more about your trip in terms of what influenced sort of your talk today. Like you, I feel that there will eventually be a deal, but there will be lots of ups and downs, and it's not going to be smooth, and it's not going to happen anytime soon. Curious to know, in terms of what insights you gained there, and as far as you can share them with us about the the priorities, time frame, and again, you yourself mentioned the desire maybe to sort of be involved vis-a-vis Syria. Vis-a-vis Iraq, Iran uses its proxies as sort of bargaining chips in negotiations in general. I mean, this nuclear deal presumably will free you to a general overall peace deal. So how do you foresee these things evolving?
And Mehrdad?
Thank you. My question is, I think that in the presentation, the importance of the role that sanctions play was not highlighted. I mean, would you agree that were it not for the sanctions, there would not have been an imperative on the part of the Rouhani government that was elected on the back of a terrible economic situation in the country to want to get involved and for the Supreme Leader to offer his support for the negotiations? Now, when you look at it from the importance of the role that sanctions play and the importance that the dealing with the economy has in the Iranian psyche, if you look at the course of the negotiations in the last 8 or 9 months, would you not say that the threat of, let's say, Western military intervention has subsided, while at the same time the Iranian internal economic situation has become exacerbated because nothing has improved other than the fact that they've stopped the corruption of the Ahmadinejad government? But in real terms, that is the issue for the Iranians. And I don't believe that what Khamenei is the hardliner in this issue, in this particular case, although, and I wouldn't pay too much credence to his call about 190,000 centrifuges, because those negotiations were going to be deadlocked and he knew it. But the point that I want to make is, again, that when Dina talked about the backlash inside Iran, I think that there could be a backlash, but not necessarily against the West or against the government, but against those elements in the regime who are preventing the consummation of a deal which everybody and the public wants.
Okay, thank you. Dina, why don't you start with both questions, but as quickly as possible, and then Mark also, if you could give some quick response.
In terms of my trip, so I was only there for a week, and I tried to speak to as many people as I possibly could within the constraints that obviously we face when we go there. So didn't get to talk to many hardliners, for example, funnily enough, but did get to chat to various people that work on foreign policy, various people that work on the nuclear issue, people in government, in the MFA, in other parts of government, and then of course you talk to people every day, you know, when you go shopping in the bazaar, or when you're driving in a taxi, or you just chat to them. And you know, something that's quite interesting is that under, or at least compared to the memories that I had from when I was there 10 years ago, under this administration, people seem to be, the general population certainly seem to be much more open about talking about these issues and talking about what they're unhappy about, what they want to change, the fact that everybody wants a deal, we want to move forward, we're done with this era of oppression, etc., etc. And as I said, there really is a popular frustration with the nuclear issue, although I would argue that up until a couple of years ago, everybody bought into it being an issue of national prestige. Now, many Iranians will say to you, yes, well, if you know, it is our right, we are entitled to it, but then it'll be followed with, but at what cost? You know, we're tired. We don't want to talk about this. We have bigger fish to fry at home than this. And so I think that the problem is that in Iran, and in terms of the sequence of priorities, the nuclear issue is the most important issue right now. That's the one thing that everybody wants to tackle and get out of the way as soon as possible. The current administration, other than the hardliners, of course, the current administration, perhaps even Khamenei to a certain extent, and certainly the population. Once this is out of the way, the general belief is that if they are able to secure a nuclear deal, Rouhani will come home, or his administration will come home strengthened. They'll have more credibility. He'll be able to go to Khamenei and say, you know, you gave me this mandate, it was successful, now give me more flexibility on other issues. So the president is able to do quite a bit on the economy in Iran. And I think that is in terms of domestic priorities, that will definitely be the next issue to tackle. He's certainly been doing a little bit at the moment, but he's not able to do as much as he wants to just because of the constraints he faces because of sanctions, etc. So domestically, it'll be the economy, and then internationally, this administration, certainly from the exchanges that I've had with them, they really want things to be different. They want to increase, you know, back and forths with Iran. They're really trying to get as many foreigners to visit Iran as possible, to basically put on a show and say, look at us, we're a normal country. We want to be open to the West. There's a lot of suspicion in Iran about Russia and China and about their viability as economic partners. I mean, don't get me wrong, if things don't work out, of course they'll go for them. They won't hesitate. But the point is that right now they don't trust them, which is odd because you'd say, well, why should they trust the West? It's not like, you know, there's a lot of trust there. But for some reason they really want to open up. And then they'd like to move on to other issues. So I think Iraq will be a massive priority right now. Possibly issues like Syria, like I mentioned. And then they're going to search for areas where they can possibly cooperate with people in the West, but areas that aren't too contentious. So things like the war on drugs, things like perhaps we should collaborate on Afghanistan. So, I mean, yeah, I think there's potential for that.
And very briefly, I agree with Mehrdad that sanctions were a necessary condition to get where we are today. I don't think they were a sufficient condition. I think it was also necessary that you had pragmatic leaders on both sides. So the change of government in Iran was crucial to that. And as you know, there's a debate about what extent sanctions were a fundamental reason why Rouhani was elected. The internal polling suggests it's quite low. I don't know how much weight one can give to that. But then, you know, one might say, well, if sanctions were a necessary condition then, why wouldn't additional sanctions be a necessary condition now? And I think it's, you know, that the classic metaphor. If a little bit of medicine is good for a patient, then quadruple the dose should be even better. Obviously not.
Okay, we're really running out of time. I'm going to take two more questions, coupled with apologies to the 4 people who have asked for the floor, who I'm not going to be able to call on. Starting with you, sir, and then you.
with me?
Yes.
Yes. My name is Reza. I have worked with the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran. I agree with Mark that the pretension of Iran that we can make our own fuel for nuclear power plant is not practical. It takes a long time, and it costs too much. And they need also a testing reactor for 50 megawatts to test that nuclear fuel. So that option is not valid. But there is another option to get a license. And many countries, including even France, they got their license from Westinghouse to make nuclear fuel. Now they master the technology. But at the beginning, they had to get the license. They can ask for a license from Russia, for example. There is two questions. If the Russia is willing to give them a license, and second, making the plant for nuclear power plants is a matter of feasibility. If they have one reactor, one nuclear power plant, it's not feasible. You have to have 5 to 10. So that possibility exists also to get the license.
Thank you. And the final question?
Yeah, Mark, first of all, I want to commend you for being one of the very first analysts who said that this deal, this July 20 deal will not happen. They're not going to reach an agreement. So I commend you for that. Secondly, we don't talk much about the Russian posturing about this. Do you think Russian variable is there, it exists, that Putin might do something to wreck these talks just to retaliate against, things that the West is doing to Russia? And to Dina, weren't you afraid of going to Iran, knowing that Mrs. Esfandiary was taken, as a prisoner? She was staying in prison, I think, for a long time, 8 months or something like that. What kind of assurance you had before going to Iran? Thank you.
Okay, well, actually, it's an interesting question on what order to take those questions in, but I think I'll actually let Dina answer that rather serious question at the end. So, Mark.
Okay, so both questions actually had a Russian component. I wrote a blog posting toward the end of June saying that contrary to popular belief and expectations, Russia was actually cooperating quite well with the other powers in Iran talks, that they went out of their way to tell Iran, you've got to limit your program. Now, there was a commercial reason for that, because Russia wants to sell nuclear power plants and fuel to Iran. They don't want Iran producing their own fuel. Now, so the question comes up. Oh, and by the way, shortly after I wrote that blog, I got insider information from negotiators that actually Russia had been cooperating well, but was no longer so cooperative, and we're seeing a little bit more of that today. I don't think Putin is going to do anything to rupture the talks. That's not the way Russia behaves. They're more subtle than that. Actually, and it goes to the question that Reza asked, would Russia be willing to give a license for fuel manufacture, or would Russia be willing to engage in a joint production whereby Iran does the initial oxidation and fuel fabrication, and then Russia does more, something like that? Anyway, I think there the commercial interests of Russia are no. Why would they do that? Why would they give up the billions of dollars that they get from the fuel? Well, one answer would be if that was Iran's condition for building more power plants. Conceivably, if Russia got 5 to 10 more power plants out of the deal, and then it would become economically feasible for Iran to produce its own fuel for 10 power plants. And so you could see a long-term way that this could work out. Not by 2021, obviously. And that's why I say when the limits on this deal are reached, and at some future point where there's confidence that Iran's program is peaceful, then a lot of things would be possible along those lines.
Dina, you have the opportunity, though not the requirement, to answer the final question.
No, I have no problem answering it. I had absolutely no assurances, and I was terrified of going back. But this was the best time to do it. I had the opportunity to go for work because I was invited for a conference as part of the Iranian drive to be open towards the West. and have more meetings in Iran, bring people in to talk to government, etc. So I jumped at the chance to do it, and it so far went okay, and hopefully I'll go back in a couple months.
Okay. Well, again, I'd like to apologize to the 4 people I wasn't able to recognize, but I hope you'll join me in thanking our speakers for truly excellent presentations.